on just a second. Okay. Let me get back to my original. All right. Well, I'd like to thank the Ozark Society for inviting me here to speak tonight. I found out all about you, and you've done such wonderful work. You're as old as I am, just about. So, yeah, I'm really honored to be here tonight to share with you some unsettling information about animal agriculture, but it's just a good thing to get to know these days. So, starting off, anyone ever heard of this guy? Anyone know who he is? He's a guy named Adam Conover, and he has a show on, I don't know, it's on something, but Netflix or something, but he'll get like beloved American cultural pastimes, habits, just something that we always do, and explain like how it's terrible. And the show is called Adam Ruins Everything, right? And so anyway, I'd like to thank the Ozark Society for inviting me to come to give you Stephanie Ruins Everything. On the environmental aspects of animal agriculture. So yeah, so if you're asking who is this Stephanie person, real quick, I'll tell you, I've been a cardiac nurse for 27 years. I used to run an outpatient heart failure clinic for about 20 years. Stacy said, ended up making a change in 2019. I was just ready for something different. But I worked with patients that were facing end-stage heart failure, bridging to transplants and artificial hearts. So basically, I've witnessed the effects of the standard American diet on my patient's health my entire life. After I started the microgreens business, my husband developed diabetes, ironically enough. And I had just peripherally heard that from a documentary that you could reverse diabetes with a plant-based diet. And so as soon as I saw blood work showing that he was diabetic, I said, we're going plant-based. So we did. Reversed his diabetes in 4 months, both lost 20 pounds. And so then at that point, I was just fell down the rabbit hole with this plant-based nutrition thing, went on to get a certification, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it from there. But so tonight, let's talk about the environmental aspects of the effects that animal agriculture has just globally on everything we do, and understand that it's important to go way back in time so we can get some perspective. But if we go back about 100,000 years ago, this is how we generally procured food, by hunting and gathering, right? And frequently it wasn't super efficient. We didn't multiply our numbers very rapidly. We would frequently get eaten in the process. But then around 8500 BC here, we developed agricultural methods and finally learned, figured out ways to plant seeds into the soil, get our calories a little bit more efficiently and predictably, and started fencing in animals so we could have even more concentrated calories. At this point, eating animals was really useful for human health, and we really exploded in population. This is a really important graph to understand here. This is the population of the world. Starting back here, advent of animal agriculture, about 4 million people. The entire world's population was about the size of Houston, okay? But if we move forward in time, this right here is about 1850s or so. All right, here we're at about 1.6 billion humans on Earth. And this is when we start to have the beginnings of industrialized agriculture. We get the railroads across the United States. We start being able to ship cattle back and forth. We start having you can go to the butchers and buy your meat instead of having to slaughter the animal yourself, right? So we start to get calories a lot more easier, okay? If we move here to, this is about 1973, and you can see this is the population of the globe. So right here, we're about 1.6 billion. In the 70s, we're at 4 billion, and that line is only going straight up, right? This is a population explosion as our calories get easier and easier. And yeah, right around 1973 is during the Nixon administration. I think there was something about housewives were marching in the street because the price of meat had really skyrocketed. So Nixon administration under his agricultural secretary, Earl Butz, changed agricultural policy to, that's the beginnings of our hyper-industrialized agricultural system that we have today, planting crops fence row to fence row, subsidizing crops to ensure stability, and above all, making sure that meat and dairy is very cheap, because it is widely believed that it is absolutely necessary for health and for survival to have meat and dairy, okay? So here we go. We're going to talk about whether hyper-industrialized agriculture, as far as animal products go, with a population of 8 billion people is a good idea or not. So I'm going to divide this presentation into like all sorts of meat that I'm going to ruin for you. Okay, so we're going to start with cows. All right. So if we go back, you know, like this is what you get a quart of milk. This is the picture you're going to have on it, right? Beautiful bucolic farm. And this is about how we farmed, you know, like 200 years ago. We've got the animals, we've got our row crops, we're using the manure from the cows to fertilize the crops. And then the cows eat the corn and eat the soy or whatever they need. And everything stays in one place. This is a closed loop system. Okay, but today in our hyper-industrialized system, we have a linear farming system, and that's where we grow crops all across America. Anyone ever driven like I-80, you know, Nebraska, Iowa, it's all corn, right? So we're growing corn all across the country with industrialized methods. We're using nitrogen fertilizer. We harvest the corn in the winter. That nitrogen is just going to run off with the rainfall, go into our fresh water, go into the Gulf. And then we've got all the cows in one place, okay, on these CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. And so that's where we're trucking all the grain to, right? And then the cows are going to produce a bunch of this, a bunch of manure. You guys are familiar with manure, right? With the Buffalo River, yeah, with the hog farms. So yeah, the CAFOs produce a bunch of manure. It has to be stored in manure lagoons. There is no agricultural use for this, okay? And this creates a lot of greenhouse gases too. So this is not an efficient system. The reason is this system assumes that we have just finite resources or infinite resources, but that is not the case. All of these crops require a whole lot of fresh water to irrigate. And we're getting this water out of aquifers, right? We're usually drilling a well and then irrigating with that. So the crops require a whole lot of water. Cows drink a whole lot of water, you can imagine. So irrigating feed crops and raising livestock consumes 56% of the fresh water available in the United States, approximately 70% of the fresh water available globally. And in underdeveloped countries, about 90% of their fresh water goes to livestock commodities. The crops are harvested and then shipped to Europe. So Europe, because they don't have as much land as we do to feed their cows. All right. By 2030, it's estimated that we could be facing a 40% global freshwater deficit. That's kind of what we need to eat food, right? To grow crops. By 2050, we could run out of fresh water altogether due to global meat demand. A quarter pounder, which we're all familiar with, requires 660 gallons of fresh water to create, which is about 2 months of showering. So it's just not an efficient use of our limited water resources. The amount of land that we use for animal agriculture, the red here shows all of the animal feed crops. So corn, soy, things like that. And like in Arkansas, that soy is our #1 crop, mostly going to the animals. The green is crops grown for human consumption. So the vast majority of the land in the United States is used to grow feed crops for animals. Livestock systems occupy 45% of the land surface of the globe. Okay, only 29% of the globe is land, and only 71% of that land is farmable. Okay, so we're using half of that 71% to grow crops for livestock. We're using 50% of the world's grains to give us only 13% of the world's calories. So it's a very inefficient way to get calories. And so usually, you know, like before I was plant-based, I would always be careful to get grass-fed beef, right? Thinking that's a much more responsible way. But if we switched, if I had a magic wand or I was a benevolent dictator and said, overnight, we're gonna all switch to grass-fed beef, with our current consumption patterns, we would have to sod over all of the United States, all of the Grand Canyon, New York City. It's going up into Canada, covering all of Central America and the top third of South America. That is to have enough grass for all of the cows we eat. So there's no real feasible way for us to switch to a different kind of beef. We simply can't eat the amount that we're eating on a finite planet. Then we end up needing more land for all these feed crops, because also you have to understand, in developing countries like in China, as they have rising living standards, the first thing they're going to want to do is be able to eat more meat. And we've been eating lots of meat for hundreds of years, but other countries haven't. And so as their global meat demand increases, the livestock, I mean, like grains are imported internationally. So then the Amazon rainforest is clear cut to make way for corn and soy again. And we've already lost 80% of the Brazilian rainforest to animal crops, for animal agriculture. We've lost all of this biodiversity. Since 1970, we've wiped out over 60% of the animal populations on the planet. And scientists say the more we get rid of these forests to just turn them into fields for corn and soy, which are highly extractive crops, scientists say the tipping point at which rainforest can turn into savanna is at hand, 2025 to 2035. And so once we get to these tipping points, we've lost our good topsoil and everything starts to turn to sand. This is a process called desertification, which is spreading across the globe. Almost a third of the planet's land is turning to desert, mostly due to livestock grazing. And so then on to another feel-good topic, global warming. How does this affect global warming? You've probably heard something about methane and cows, right? And we're most familiar with CO2 emissions from transportation. That's really where a lot of like the public effort is focused, is like getting us to go to electric vehicles and solar power and all. We need to do everything we can. But methane is actually a very much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. Different scientists say it's has anywhere from 22 to 88 times the heat trapping capacity of CO2. So it's a much stronger, more potent greenhouse gas. And so it does come from cows. Only 5% of the methane comes out the back end. It's basically the process of like digesting grass creates methane. 95% of the methane comes out the front end, and then manure lagoons produce a whole lot of methane. So if we look at the big picture here with methane or animal agriculture and the entirety of greenhouse gas emissions, if we look at transportation, it's estimated that 13% of greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. But once we factor in the methane emissions that the cows produce, clear cutting land, burning trees for feed crops, the transportation for all of these things, nitrogen fertilizer that releases nitrous oxide, which is the most potent greenhouse gas. If we combine all that together, 51% of greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to animal agriculture. And in addition to all the greenhouse gases, we've probably heard of the dead zones in the Gulf. All that nitrogen washes off the crops, goes into the Gulf, and is like a hyper nutrient rich environment. It creates an anaerobic environment that's depleted of oxygen. And so that's why we call it the dead zone. And then fish will swim into this dead zone and there is no oxygen and then they die. So it's not just the Gulf dead zone. We have dead zones all across the globe. These are like open water dead zones, and then these are coastal dead zones. So yes, this is a problem that is just spreading all over. All right, so speaking of the ocean, why don't I go ahead and ruin seafood for you, okay? So let's talk about overfishing. What's the first thing that happens when you go to the doctor and you got high cholesterol? What does your doctor tell you? Switch to salmon, right? Just eat fish. Okay, so in order to satisfy our demand for our heart-healthy salmon, commercial fishermen use drift nets. We use huge commercial fishing operations that suck up all of the life on the ocean floor, basically. For every 1 pound of fish caught, we get 5 pounds of other marine species that get caught that are called bykill, okay? So, we'll pull out the one profitable fish that we were looking for, and then we toss back all the sea turtles, all the other things back into the ocean. And they don't multiply quickly enough to replenish themselves. So it's estimated that by now, fully 30% of the ocean's fish species have collapsed and all the others are overexploited. And what's the top of the list? Samples of fish stocks that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association says are overfished. That's your salmon, okay? So I just feel from a medical point of view, it's irresponsible for us to recommend that everyone switch to salmon. We just simply can't do that. We've lost nearly 90% of all large fish in the ocean. It's estimated that we could have fishless oceans by 2048. It's up to us if we keep pulling them out, that we simply don't have enough fish left to satisfy global demand for 8 billion people with the huge fishing capacity that we have now with these huge drift nets, okay? And it's just not adequately regulated. And it's also estimated that a third of your like responsible marine stewardship labeling on fish is fraudulent, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and ruin chicken while we're on a roll here, okay? Who loves chicken? We're gonna be healthy. We're gonna eat our chicken on our salads and our salmon, right? Yeah. So we eat around 2 million chickens per hour. If we spread them wing to wing, the amount of chickens that we eat every day would wrap twice around the globe, all right? That's what we consider health food, chicken. So at that rate, we're going to have to produce an awful lot of chicken to keep up with the global demand for the healthy chicken, right? I wonder if that would lead to any problems. So I'm going to talk real quickly about the problems we have when we confine chickens to a small space to produce tons of cheap chicken. All right. So we're going to talk about our human history of raising animals for food. And epidemiologists define, the first era of human disease as diseases of domestication. So if we go back to like the advent of the agricultural revolution, we first started fencing in animals, okay? We didn't used to really have any epidemic diseases prior to the beginning of animal husbandry, but when we brought formerly wild animals into the barnyard, we also brought their diseases in with us. And viruses are really good at learning how to mutate rapidly. And they are, as they are described as, masters of interspecies navigation. They learn how to mutate really quick and they learn how to jump from one species to another. So we domesticated horses and we got the common cold. We domesticated cows and sheep and we got measles. We domesticated camels. We got smallpox. We domesticated cows. We got whooping cough, water buffalo, ended up with leprosy. And the virus of influenza lived in the intestines of migrating waterfowl, namely ducks, harmlessly for thousands of years. Then we domesticated the ducks and we got influenza, which we have lived with since then, okay? The second era of human disease is diseases of industrialization. And this is like back like on that first slide, back in the 1850s, we start, really efficiently getting our meat and dairy all from one place. We start to get excessive calories, higher amounts of fat than humans have ever eaten in all of history. We weren't really adapted for that. So we started to develop diseases like what we call foodborne diseases, like or what we now call chronic disease, things like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension, which is about 80% of medical costs today. But then we're going to skip fast forward to the third era of human disease, which overlays on top of our chronic disease epidemic, okay? And this is exactly what we saw with COVID. We've all got chronic disease, most of us, and then we get a pandemic, okay? So the era of pandemics happened, it's the newest era, and it emerged just around 40 years ago, okay? So I want you to think back to that population slide. What else emerged about 40, 50 years ago? Remember? The hyper-industrialization of our agricultural systems. So we didn't, in fact, in the 50s, there was an article published in which it was some science journal where a doctor was crowing about having wiped out infectious disease almost. They were the era of triumph over infectious disease, okay? But then we started pinning in all these animals in tiny confined spaces, and we started getting a lot of epidemics and then pandemics, okay? Because we've domesticated animals for 10,000 years, but it wasn't until we put them in such tiny spaces that now the National Academy of Medicine describes our epidemic risk as a catastrophic storm of microbial threats. and the frequency is increasing so much that they say it is going from the equivalent of snowflakes to an avalanche. Okay, so we get things like SARS and Nipah, MERS disease. These are all these pandemic diseases. What's happening is we are impinging on what used to be wild environments. So any newly exploited environmental niche, a virus is going to exploit and try to mutate. Okay, so we've got all this rainforest logging. There's no Wendy's to go to for lunch, so they're having to eat bush meat. Okay, we have the exotic pet trade. We have, let me go here, the exotic meat trade and wet markets that brings all sorts of animals right into contact, all swapping germs back and forth. Okay, and then we have a 500% increased meat production in the past decade to meet our growing demand for animal protein. Okay, and of course the population is continuing to expand, and that meat demand expands year after year after year. Okay, so when we got the former mild form of influenza that just lived in the intestines of ducks for thousands of years, then it starts spreading amongst humans, right? This got to be a little bit of problematic when an H5 goose virus ended up combining with an N1 duck virus. And this mutated to become a form called avian flu, H5N1, spread by migratory ducks, but then it started infecting chicken flocks, confined chicken flocks. Okay, this is a problem because they're all sitting there wing to wing. They are given antibiotics to suppress their immune system because there's diseases rampant. So the virus can just spread and spread and spread. Okay, and this is an influenza virus. Okay, so H5N1, otherwise known as avian flu, first surfaced in Hong Kong in 1997 in a chicken flock. Okay, but then it's going to it transmits to poultry workers that are getting directly infected from the chickens. Why is this a big deal? So let's get some perspective on the severity of pandemics. So if we look at COVID-19, we're all familiar with that. In the United States, it has a 1.13% case fatality rate. That's the percentage of people that die that get it. And the scoring system for pandemics is kind of like hurricanes. And that, like when I first did this the first time, it was at a category 2, okay? But the mortality rate has gone up. So now it's about a category 4. The Spanish flu is the deadliest pandemic known to man so far. In 1918, it had a 2% mortality rate. And after it goes all the way around the globe, that's a lot of people, about 100 million deaths. So the problem with avian flu is that the poultry workers typically that have contracted avian flu, they have a mortality rate of greater than 50%. Okay. And so our fear is it's influenza. This isn't HIV, that's blood and body fluid. It's respiratorily transmitted. And this is like the CDC is well aware of this. All epidemiologists track this. That we have the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Prevention, Dr. Michael Osterholm at CIDRAP tracks H5N1 or avian flu and all the mutations thereof continually. Okay, they have vaccines developed, but the virus continues to mutate. Okay, so if it ever mutates to the point where it is transmissible from one human to another, then we've got something that can spread as quickly as COVID, but has a 50% mortality rate. So it's a terrifying thing to comprehend. It is estimated that H5N1 would shut down global markets overnight. Nothing would move back and forth. It would last 1 to 2 years. It's estimated that the internet would shut down within 3 days. Where are we going to get chlorine for our water? Do we have enough domestically, or are we importing it from China? It's really difficult to even comprehend the effects of a global transmission of H5N1. And when I first found out about H5N1, I started doing more research, and it was kind of in the process of learning about this animal agriculture stuff. And I kept looking for an epidemiologist that said like, and so this is what we can do to prevent it. Okay. I've never seen a single epidemiologist that has said that this is preventable. The only way to prevent it is to stop putting chickens in enclosed sheds. And it's very hard to regulate the agricultural industry here, but even if we could regulate it here, this spreads by migratory ducks. You have to regulate it globally. You'd have to undo the concentrated chicken operations globally. So yeah, these are all very sobering statistics. This is our pandemic preparedness closet, but they recommend that you just stock up with food. And if you want to learn more about this, I recommend getting this book, and I'm going to have some resources for you afterwards. You'll have this all written down. But Dr. Michael Greger, he wrote this when COVID came out. And this is an epidemiologist that's also plant-based. And so he wrote a book called How to Survive a Pandemic, and that spells out all this information about avian flu. But there's a lot of reasons to back off of our meat consumption. Okay. And it's just something that we don't seem to hear a lot about. We seem to be focusing all of our climate disaster scenarios on CO2 and, carbon emissions from coal and cars. But a plant-based diet, switching to a predominantly plant-based diet, has potentially transformative effects. We can reduce land use by 76%, agricultural emissions of greenhouse gases by 50%, dead zones by 49%. Switching to a plant-based diet would reduce our land requirements for agriculture by an amount the size of the continent of Africa. Okay, because it's so inefficient to grow all of these grains for cows. Cutting methane emissions in half would equal the impact of stopping CO2 emissions for the next 45 years entirely, okay? And it could reduce global warming by 0.55 degrees Celsius. That is huge. We are desperately trying to keep, our goal was always 1.5. Now we're trying to keep it below 2, okay? After 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, we don't really even know what happens at that point, okay? And the good thing about methane, which is the kind of the main animal agriculture greenhouse gas, methane can draw down in decades. But CO2 takes centuries to draw down, okay? So this is all pretty much of a bummer. This is not a feel-good presentation tonight, is it? And humans just don't like to change. We would just like to carry on with the same cultural habits that our parents and our grandparents have always had. It's unsettling for us to think that the world is changing around us, and we're going to have to change. And this little conveyor belt thing, this reminds me of a conversation I had with one of my teenage boys a couple of years ago about going down a path that just was not good for him. And I said, you know what, buddy, you are an equivalent, like you are in effect laying on a conveyor belt, and all your friends are on the conveyor belt with you, and you're just going along with the flow. This is the status quo. But you know what, that conveyor belt, it ends up in a wood chipper. And the only way to escape that wood chipper, like, you're going to have to move your body. You are going to have to do something. You can't just go with the flow. So that conveyor belt right there, that is our animal agricultural system. All right. It'd be great if there were like some really proactive, like governmental intervention that would just move the conveyor belt away from the wood chipper, right? But like theoretically it could happen, but I would not hold my breath that we're going to get some really proactive legislation that will like ban agricultural antibiotic use or undo concentrated animal feeding operations. The best way we can take action and have an effect change is to simply stop eating this food, decrease the demand for meat, because industry is very responsive to consumer demand, but it's basically captured regulatory potential at this point, and we don't see much regulation in the area of animal agriculture at all. So let me see. To keep global warming under 2 degrees in the next decades, which is imperative to prevent just catastrophic changes, it is estimated that we need to decrease our meat demand by 80%. Okay, so if we're eating animal protein, if we're eating animal protein 3 times a day, your yogurt for breakfast, your turkey wrap for lunch, your salmon for dinner. Okay, it's estimated that Americans eat about 2 to 3 burgers per week. All right. Cutting that down by 80% would be 4 servings of animal protein per week. Okay, that's quite a huge decrease for most of us. If we were going to try to maintain our animal protein intake or our animal agriculture to an amount that's sustainable for water use, there would be just enough water if we decreased our animal-based protein to 5% of total calories, okay? So if we eat 2,000 calories a day, that's 100 calories. This is 100 calories of chicken, okay? That'd be your animal protein limit for the day, all right? So this would all be really unsettling if the imperative to really eliminate animal protein from our diet, if that meant that we were going to be gravely ill, or this is going to cause us all sorts of malnutrition. But we know from decades of research that humans typically improve their health drastically when we switch from a diet like this, our typical standard American diet, to a whole food plant-based diet. With my 20-year background in chronic disease management, which is what I did, we just manage the disease until you die. Okay, we don't really expect to reverse chronic disease in the typical medical field. So once I learned about the transformative effects of plant-based nutrition, I realized like what we need to focus on is just the chronic diseases that kill us. Like instead of just having a philosophy about like what we should eat or what's natural or you know, like whether you should eat gluten or not, what's the number one killer? Heart disease, okay? Is there any research showing that we can really mitigate heart disease with any kind of dietary pattern? Why, yes, there is. We have found that a whole food plant-based diet is 40 times more effective at keeping heart attack survivors heart attack proof than the conventionally recommended Mediterranean diet. I don't like to compare whole food plant-based to like gas station food. I like to compare it to the recommended diet, what we consider our healthy diet, the chicken salmon diets, okay? A whole food plant-based diet is 3 times more effective at lowering blood sugars in diabetics than the American Diabetes Association diet, okay? And the ADA now does recommend or does allow that a plant-based diet is an effective diet for the treatment of diabetes. We can also mitigate 80% of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and 40% of cancer could be prevented with improvements to diet and lifestyle. Okay, so yes, after I figured all this out, and what I used to do in my old day job was create programs to keep heart failure patients out of the hospital and a chronic disease management program. So I realized that, you know, like heart failure in a cardiac specialty hospital, that the patients just stretch out to the curb. So you got to have a plan to funnel them all through a system to try to keep the expenses to the taxpayer under control, because that's the number one expense for Medicare, heart failure patients going into the ER and being admitted. So once I figured out this plant-based nutrition thing and I got my certification in plant-based nutrition, I learned so much there that I had never learned in the medical field, 30 years. I decided to create a course called the 21-Day Plant-Based Challenge. And I started teaching it live, and then COVID hit, then I switched it online. And so that's what I do. I focus on the main diseases that kill and make us sick. So the first class is 2 hours of where do you get your protein? The second class is type 2 diabetes reversal and then also prevention. The third class is heart disease. Then the fourth class is weight loss. So basically the whole idea, you learn for 4 weeks. We just take our time learning some new cooking skills. Then we dive in for 21 days, 100%. That's the challenge part. We check labs pre and post. I have like 10 hours of classes, 43 learning modules. We have homework assignments, little worksheets where you can plug your current labs in, see what we want to aim for to be like heart attack proof. We're not just managing anymore. We want to undo these diseases, and they can absolutely be done. We have social media support. We have a support group. There's many people here that are in our monthly support group, our Food is Medicine Club. Anyway, and a lot more. So anyway, I'm going to give you some information about that. But yeah, so what do we eat on a plant-based diet? I hope this works. We'll see. I don't think the sound's going to work. You never know. Oh, hey. So Einstein said that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it, right? So what's our old level of consciousness? That's that the Earth's resources are infinite. We just need to use our ingenuity to become as efficient as possible in increasing human progress, which is like eating as much meat as possible. It's kind of what we believed as the summit of all human perfection, right? But our new consciousness that we need to develop into is respecting the boundaries of a finite planet, right? We are a part of nature. We're not a ruler over nature. And if we simply live in a more simple manner, respecting our place in the earth, then we can leave a safer environment and have safety and stability and an environment worth living in for our children and our grandchildren. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so hit me with your questions.
I know, I've taken the course. Semi-plant-based diet, call myself a flexitarian for a long time before her course.
That's how most people start. That's what I was flexitarian for 8 years and then I went plant-based.
Well, at one point I was totally like, and I did drop a lot of weight. But anyway, what I was going to tell you that I was just going to ask you because I've been wanting to ask you this, but I haven't called you up. You know, have you heard that AARP put out this thing that said people my age and older needed 25 grams of protein at every meal?
Oh, that's insane.
I think it's insane too, and it's almost impossible on a plant-based diet to get that.
Right. So the RDA for protein, the recommended daily allowance, which was set like in World War II, so we could determine how to ration food and like how much calories do people need. The RDA for protein is 10% of caloric intake. Okay. And in reality, most Americans get way too much protein. Excessive protein leads to lots of problems. And on this sheet, this is going to be the fastest way to explain this. There's a little QR code. And I just discovered that if you hold your camera up and take a picture of the QR code, these days your phone's just going to flip it over to a link. Click that link, and it's a video that I did. It's like a cooking show that I was on. But in this video, I explain in depth the difference between plant protein and animal protein, the different amino acid profiles. But I'm going to tell you a short answer. The kind of amino acid profile, which is a high essential amino acid profile that we get in all animal proteins, called a complete protein, right? That kind of amino acid profile makes our body have high levels of this thing called insulin-like growth factor 1, which creates I want to grow blood vessels environment that our body is in. So if we get cancer, a little mutated cancer cell, our body is going to want to grow a blood supply to that cancer cell. This will start to happen once your animal protein intake exceeds 10% of calories. Okay, I recommend keeping animal protein, if you are going to eat any, around 5% of calories. T. Colin Campbell in the China studies, like based on 800 million, the Chinese Cancer Atlas, but this is the largest nutritional study ever done in the medical history. He found that chronic disease, meaning cancers, heart disease, diabetes, things that kill us, start to skyrocket above 10% of caloric intake when animal protein exceeds 10% of caloric intake. And so like 10% of caloric intake is going to be like 2 of those little chicken slices. I recommend keeping it to 5%.
Is that a week or a day?
A day. Yeah. So like if you're having just like that tiny little sliver of chicken, and that's it. No milk, no dairy, like that's your, like, or that's the equivalent amount. So like in the blue zones in China, in rural China, there's no such thing as an indigenous vegan society. Okay. But the plant-based societies that typically live to be 100 or long, like centenarians, the blue zones, places where like in Uganda, they have hospitals where there's never been a single case of a heart attack. There's never been any colon cancer because this is a plant-based society that gets 100 grams of fiber a day. Okay. They're not keeling over because they're sick because they didn't get the AARP's recommended amount of protein. Okay. Like there are societies all over the globe. In fact, prior to us industrializing almost every remote area on Earth, 60% of the globe ate this way, not coming anywhere near what the AARP recommends. Okay. So short answer.
They didn't say it had to be animal protein. They just said we should have 25 grams of protein,
Okay.
either animal or meat protein, but you can have a combination or just just plant protein.
Yeah.
So that's 75 grams
So
of protein. That's a lot.
that is a lot. So 10%, the recommended daily allowance, it gives you a margin. Okay. We only require 5% of animal protein. What's the most perfect food that God created for humans? That comes straight from breast milk. Do you know what the protein content of breast milk is? 5 to 6%. So I'm going to say God knows more than the AARP. Okay. That's what human protein requirements absolutely. You will be protein deficient if you go below 5%. Okay. So the RDA always gives a buffer because they don't want you to be like, okay, I got the 10%, but like 9.8% would cause deficiency. No, 10% is actually a 5% buffer. Humans only require about 25 grams of protein a day. But with the buffer of the RDA, so that no one ever suffers any deficiency, a typical like 150-pound female, it would be about 46 grams of protein a day. Your typical male would be about 57 grams of protein a day. And you can easily get that from a plant-based diet. The only time you are ever going to be protein deficient, I always tell people, is if you literally do not have the use of your arms to propel food into your mouth. If you can eat food, if you can walk, you will get enough protein. It is one of the greatest myths in American culture that you are protein deficient. Who's visited someone in the hospital recently, right? Or in the last 5 years, let's say. Were they there because of protein deficiency? Like protein deficiency is almost unheard of. It does happen in people that are bedbound and cachectic and usually near death, okay? In someone that can walk, protein deficiency is almost unheard of. I don't know why they push that so much. Protein excess can cause kidney failure. It causes excessive heart disease. We generally cannot tolerate the amount of fat that accompanies the animal protein. But the plant protein comes in a low fat package. There is fat, protein, and carbohydrates in all plants. It's not just protein only comes from meat. You can get all the protein. You can get all the protein you need just from eating oatmeal. You can get it's all available in plants. But anyway, I know it's like shocking to hear that, and it takes a lot more than me just saying it one time or putting something on a bumper sticker. On my website, you have the information there. If you subscribe on my website, you'll immediately get a video. It's a 1-hour free webinar that explains all this research, and I explain fairly definitively, I think, about animal protein versus plant protein. And just like people have to wrap their heads around that before you can even proceed to think like, well, what could I switch to? Because I didn't think that we could survive on plant protein until I learned more. So, yeah.
What does the egg fit into your protein scheme?
Yeah, eggs are, egg yolks are the highest cholesterol source known to man. Let me say it this way. Most Americans, we have eaten, like anyone here, a Sardinian shepherd that grew up in the island in the Mediterranean and has never been in an industrialized food system? No, we've never, no one ever has here. We've all lived in an industrialized food system our whole life, okay? So generally by the time we're middle-aged, we are having chronic diseases. It's estimated that only like 5% of the population has like a healthy cardiometabolic health, okay? So generally when we are in a situation of having chronic disease, like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, heart disease, you will not make progress in real clinical terms if you continue to like, oh, I'm just eating eggs, oh, I'm just eating cheese, like I let go of the red meat, but I'm switching to you're not going to make any progress. That's why cardiologists and doctors in general are not excited about nutrition, because the nutrition that we recommend never makes much of a difference. Okay, you switch to a plant-based diet, insulin-dependent diabetic, research has shown they can decrease their insulin demand by 60% in 16 days. People with chronic chest pain, switch to a plant-based diet, that can go away in about 3 weeks. Okay, we have huge improvements. Arthritis pain starts to go away in about 2 to 3 weeks. If you go 100%, you can start backing off on your blood pressure pills in about 2 weeks. This never happens with all our pills and procedures. And I'm like, I did heart failure for 20 years. Heart failure doesn't just go away. But there's a doctor that puts patients on like an acute nutritional detox and brings them from end-stage heart failure up to an almost normal ejection fraction within 4 weeks. Like, it is astounding the effects that we can have with a plant-based diet. So that's the thing, like the moderation diet, like what if we just eat animal protein in moderation? It's not enough to change your the typical chronic disease profile that the average middle-aged American will have. Yeah.
So you would include eggs as an animal protein?
Oh yeah, yeah. So animal protein, when I say it, that means everything that comes from an animal, like eggs, milk, cheese, yogurt, red meat, chicken, fish, pork, everything. Okay. Just in practicality, usually by middle age, we can't tolerate from a health point of view. Okay. I will tell you my one caveat though, from an environmental point of view, like what's going to destroy the climate, free range eggs are probably the easiest, most responsible, like environmentally responsible source of animal protein you can get. If it is truly from a like farmer that just has, and the chickens are eating bugs. Okay. And totally like there's no danger to this avian influenza with chickens that are raised outside. Okay. We didn't start to have avian H5N1 until we started putting the chickens in the pen. I mean, in the chicken house, chicken sheds. But so like chickens have a relatively low environmental impact if they are not going to threaten us with like a civilization ending pandemic, if they're just outside. So environmentally, like that's the only way I'd say like, yeah, eggs aren't that bad, but health wise, they're not great. And in general, what you need, like a lot of people are like, well, I don't know about this. Like the first time they hear this kind of a talk. If you start to think of plant foods, and meaning a whole food plant-based diet is fruits and vegetables, we're all familiar with that, but then whole grains and legumes. You want to get 2 to 3 servings of legumes, beans, peas, or lentils 2 to 3 times a day. That will change your life. Okay. And yes, Paul, you want to tell them the story? You want to tell them about when you moved in with it? Okay. All right. This kid can tell you how.
So, hello, I'm his son. I'm 23. I'm a dude. So if I can do it, like literally anyone can. So back when they put on school and all that, I was back home. I was eating, it's awful. I was eating Chick-fil-A all the time. But the thing is that I moved back home, and by this point my parents had gone full-time based. I was mortified, absolutely mortified. I think when I moved in, I weighed like probably about, as much as I do right now, probably about 220-ish, maybe a little bit less than that. But within so they didn't have any.
He was trapped and he didn't have any money, and so he could only eat our food.
So what they did have is beans and potatoes. That's what I ate for like 3 weeks. Exclusively beans.
No, 2 months. Yeah, he would try to get out and get junk, but
And I would
yeah,
get out.
even sneaking out and getting junk every now and again. Yeah.
Yeah, like once a week, I get like a whole pizza, eat all by myself. But even then, I still lost like 20 pounds. I went below 200 for the first time in my life since like I graduated high school, or since sophomore year of high school.
Yeah.
But it works, and now I am married to someone who also can't eat animal protein literally at all for health reasons. She's allergic to just about all meat and dairy. So I have the best cook living with me ever, and she's figured out you can cook without. She uses oil, which if you look at her course, she'll go into details about why oil can be bad, but you can cook really good food without using animal proteins like meat or eggs. She gives me that recommended amount of meat you get, like that chicken. That's that's good eating for me. I get that little bit of chicken, it is great. That is, but you appreciate it a lot more if you don't get it that much. And you can, if she was here, she could tell you she has cookbooks, but she has a whole library of cookbooks that are all plant-based. And they make wonderful food. That's good for me. I love so my junk food. I literally just ate 4 tacos beforehand here. So I love typical food, but you can make plant-based food taste really good, and it's easy to do, and it's very cheap. So if you're worried about rising food costs, that's another reason. Our grocery bill this week was like $30. Take that as you will.
Oh, thank you, Paul. But yeah, like what I recommend doing is make plant-based food your everyday food and then save animal protein for a special occasion. Because honestly, if you're trying to make the switch and you're like, well, I'll just have animal protein like once a day or 5 times a week or something, you're just torturing yourself because you won't ever lose the taste for it. And it's all like cheese is always going to taste good when you snitch it again, and then you're just torturing yourself. So it's easier if you just go off of it. Your taste buds start to revive. They just wake up. And then everything you eat, I mean, like we've got a bunch of plant-basters right here. They'll tell you everything you eat, just like a corn tortilla, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so good. Like, or arugula, or like the flavors just come alive after you get that fat decreases in your diet, your taste buds wake up. So it's a really, you think it's going to be really hard when you're currently eating like cheese. I'm like, everyone loves, you're never going to wake up one day and think like, I don't like cheese anymore. You will always like cheese. You just have to choose to stop eating it, and then you lose your taste for it. And then you start really appreciate. So like those of us that do a plant-based diet, like we're not suffering. We're not going every day like, oh God, I have to go through another plant-based day. After it's hard the first 2 to 3 weeks while you're making that transition and your body's still crying out for fat, salt, and sugar. But you switch over and then you start really appreciating the taste that's just in natural food. And even if you do from a health point of view or from an environmental point of view, if you deviate on occasion, like I always tell my students, eat what you want on major holidays. Okay. Like that way we can just take that, like, what do I do at Christmas off the table? All right. It's not going to hurt your health. It's not going to hurt the environment if you eat animal products, like 5 times a year. Okay. What matters from an environmental point of view is that we share this information. Like anyone that you can get to just like switch from dairy milk to almond milk, that's a win. If you're a 100% vegan and you are the most irritating person on the earth and you make people angry and they're like, well, I'm going to have a double cheeseburger now, you're not helping anything. One person being 100% flawless is not going to change the world. What's going to change the world is right here, us talking about it. And you changing your habits, and then talking about that. And when you're talking about with your friends, what I recommend you do is talk about how it changed your health. Don't make any moral pronouncements. Don't even talk about the environment. Honestly, this is the first time I've ever been invited to speak on the environmental effects of animal agriculture. Like I live in Arkansas. And so I always lead with the health effects. It doesn't matter why I'm going to give you the John Brummett talk. You lovely people right here are not representative of the state of Arkansas. Okay. Like you're not going to change. And we've got to change a lot of minds. Okay. Like just like the Hillcresty, like West Little Rock folks that are attending the Ozark Society, that's not enough. Okay. So what I have found is if you lead with like, you can decrease your insulin requirements by 60%, everyone's like pre-diabetic by the time we get to be age 60 or 70. Okay, just about. So it's relevant to everyone in a health point of view. If they cut back their animal protein based on the health changes that they notice, that's going to make a difference in the environment. So that's my philosophy.
Well, we really thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.